Today we're going to talk about what science is telling us about how adversity has disruptive effects on the development of the brain. Answering the question of what happens when things are not going well? What happens when children are living in environments that are burdened by deep poverty, exposure to violence, maltreatment, a variety of other factors that we know statistically are associated with poor outcomes. We know that they increase the likelihood for problems in school, problems with behavior, problems with later economic productivity, lifelong problems in physical and mental health. All of those things we've known for a long time. But what the revolution in biology is kind of opening up as an exciting new frontier for us is to understand what is it about that adversity that gets into the body and leads to these problems in learning and behavior and in health. How does that happen? It's kind of opening up that black box of social determinants and getting better insights into how adversity results in poor outcomes. First, let me kind of share with you some data from a few studies that illustrate very important points. The first is a study that was done in the United States, looking at 3-year-old children who were in the Child Protective Service system, all of whom had been victimized by significant maltreatment, either abuse or neglect. And the study was asking the question of, above and beyond abuse and neglect, how does the addition of other risk factors for poor outcomes account for how well children are doing as early as age 3? This was looking at above and beyond abuse and neglect, the impact of poverty, the impact of low parent education, the impact of a mental illness in a parent, the impact of incarceration of a parent, all of these factors that we know independently also contribute to poor outcomes. 1 or 2 additional risk factors doesn't make the bottom fall out. We're not that vulnerable that we can't, generally speaking, adapt to adversity, even the adversity of maltreatment. As the number of risk factors increases, the likelihood of being able to somehow do well in spite of that really goes down. This particular study showed that by the time children were experiencing 6 or 7 risk factors in their lives, basically 90 to 100% of those children, as early as age 3, were failing a developmental assessment in many areas of function, not just affecting their emotional development or their social well-being, but their cognition and their language. This is a finding that we see again and again in everything we study. A few risk factors for most children don't do you in, but the pile up, the cumulative burden of risk factors, invariably, with few exceptions, leads to problems later on that create a burden for the children and create a huge problem for society. Let me now move to another part of the world and talk about a study done in Dunedin, New Zealand, a relatively small city. A birth cohort study was begun there several decades ago, where every pregnant woman in the city was approached about participating in a study that would begin during the pregnancy and then follow the offspring from that pregnancy well into their adult years. The data I'm going to talk about now and illustrated on this graph come from a 32-year follow-up of adults whose life stories have been documented since before they were born. And in this particular case, the study looked at the level in a blood test of a substance called C-reactive protein. This is a marker of increased inflammation. It has been well demonstrated to be associated with a somewhat higher risk for heart disease. So what this study showed at age 32 is about 15% of the healthy, normal adult population had elevated C-reactive protein levels, probably reflecting some genetic predisposition, indicating a potential increased risk for heart disease. Of those individuals who had a diagnosis of depression at age 32, clinical depression, they had a much higher level, almost 30%, had elevated C-reactive protein, which has been shown in many other studies. Individuals with depression have increased activity in their inflammatory systems. The next group were 32-year-old adults for whom there was a documented history of them having been maltreated as children. And in this particular case, over 30% of those healthy, normal adults who had a history of maltreatment had elevated C-reactive protein, much higher than the other groups. And for those who had maltreatment as a child and Depression, as a 32-year-old, almost 40% had an elevated C-reactive protein. What this means is that maltreatment early in life precipitated physiological changes in the body that continued into adult life. Whether the adult remembered being maltreated as a child consciously, even if it occurred at a very early age, whether there's a conscious memory or not, there are biological memories in the body. Things happen, things change in the body, and the body doesn't forget. The body has persistent memories of that biologically. There is an increasing scientific evidence base now of similar stories of biological changes associated with significant adversity early in life that continue into the adult years well after the adversity is over. This is beginning to help us open up that black box and start to understand what is it about early adversity that leads to more problems decades later in life. Why do individuals who had very adverse early life circumstances have more chronic illness as adults? Why do they have more heart disease? Why do they have more hypertension? Why do they have more diabetes? Why do they not live as long? Why is lifespan affected by early life experiences? Let's talk a little bit about this issue of stress and its effect on development. The first thing that's important is to recognize that all stress is not bad. Stress is a part of normal life. And protecting children from any sources of stress does not do them a favor. Children need to learn how to deal with stress. Not experiencing stress would be bad. But there are three different levels or types of stress response that the science is telling us to pay very careful attention to. The first is what we call positive stress. This is related to activation of the stress system in the face of normal everyday stresses. The stress of having to share your toys. The stress of not being able to eat any junk food that's in front of you. The stress of having to play nicely with other children. The stress of being in a new early childhood program on the first day and not really knowing anybody. All of these things activate our stress response system. Our stress response system is our friend. Without it, we would not be able to respond to threat, and our lives would be in danger. This is built into our biology. Every animal species has a stress response system. Positive stress, with the everyday challenges of being a child, going to the doctor and getting an immunization is stressful. The stress system is activated, but adults basically help you to learn how to deal with that stress, and it brings your stress system back to baseline, and you feel better physically. Next level of stress response that's a little bit more worrisome is what we call tolerable stress, which is not just, no, you can't have 5 cookies right now, but the stress that is accompanied by more serious challenges like the death of a family member or significant family conflict or being a witness to a violent event or being victimized by a natural disaster like an earthquake or a tsunami. These kinds of things that create tremendous levels of stress in everyone. And the question is, how do we get the stress system back down in the face of those threats? For young children, it depends upon whether the adults who are caring for them give them a sense of safety, a sense of security. This is why instinctively, when children are in stressful situations, the adults huddle around them, try to help them feel more secure, make them feel better. Emotionally and psychologically, it's developing a sense of well-being. Physically, biologically, it's bringing the stress system back to baseline. And that leads us to the third kind of stress response, which is the one we worry about, particularly for children who live in highly adverse environments with chronic poverty, chronic violence, and all kinds of threatening circumstances in their lives. This is what we call toxic stress, where the stress response system is activated and it stays that way most of the time. It was not designed to be activated most of the time. It was designed to deal with an acute threat. And when it's activated continuously or most of the time, it starts to have a wear and tear effect on the body. It literally wears the body down. Different parts of the stress system have different adverse effects on different parts of our bodies. For example, elevated stress hormones, particularly cortisol, which in the short term helps us be more alert, to deal and mobilize sugar for our muscles to be able to deal with a threat, If it's chronically elevated, it turns on the body. And some parts of the brain, like the prefrontal cortex, where a lot of the higher level functioning circuits are, and the hippocampus, where simple memory circuits are, those parts of the brain are very vulnerable to persistently elevated cortisol, which can literally disrupt the development of circuits while they're being made, which again is helping us understand why children who live in these chronically toxic stress environments have trouble learning. It's not simply a motivation problem. It may be a matter of disrupting circuits for parts of the brain that you need for paying attention. It's not just learning and development, it's also health. Chronic stress activation, chronic inflammation increases atherosclerosis. Chronic elevations of blood sugar can create insulin resistance, which leads to greater likelihood of getting diabetes. So toxic stress, which is chronic activation of the stress system, most of the time in early childhood, is the underlying explanation for why we see lifelong health problems and why we see learning problems. And the answer, the protection, is to get that stress system back to baseline. And there are two ways to do that, and they both involve the critical role of adults who care for young children. The first is the extent to which adults can buffer children from the sources of stress. If it's a violent community, if there's deep poverty, the extent to which adults are able to cope with that and kind of protect children from the constant sense of stress from that will help children to feel more secure and bring their system down, protecting their developing brain. But it's not just protecting children from stress, it's building their capacity to deal with stress. And this is the other critical role of responsive adult caregiving, which is to model and to help scaffold the development of coping skills in children themselves. Those skills don't come in automatically. They are shaped by experience, and they're shaped by adults who help model that and build those skills and practice them in children. Let me summarize to say that early experiences literally shape the architecture of the developing brain, for better or for worse. When children live in an environment that is relatively responsive and predictable, where there's a sense of security and safety, it promotes the development of healthy brain architecture. It promotes the development of a healthy immune system. It promotes the development of healthy cardiovascular function and metabolic regulatory systems, creating a strong foundation for lifelong health and effective development. In contrast, when children grow up in an environment of constant threat, constant burdens, heavy burdens that influence everyday function, the stress system is activated excessively. It produces what we call toxic stress, and that disrupts the development of brain circuits during their critical periods. It disrupts the cardiovascular system. It disrupts the immune system and creates a foundation for a greater risk for a whole host of physical and mental health problems and difficulties in learning. It all comes down to a very simple message, which is early experiences literally shape our biology, create either a strong or a weak foundation for all the health, learning, and behavior that follow for a lifetime.